This is a continuation of an interest I've had for some time. When I was chair of the subcommittee on manpower and housing, as it was then called, we changed the name, of the Committee on Government Operations back in 1983, I began hearings on the issues of expiring use, because coming from Massachusetts, I experienced this. As a matter of fact, one of the first projects done under this program, dating back to the 60s, is the Castle Square project in the south end of Boston. And it was when I ran for the state legislature in 1972 in downtown Boston, the heart of the only reliably Democratic precinct in my district. So I became quite attached to it and worked with it. People here who know of it. Let me say it was an example of the importance of this housing. Let me, if I can indulge for a minute. 1972, Boston was going through difficult times, in particular racially. This project, affordable housing, was located in the South End, then a poor working-class neighborhood on Tremont Street between Arlington and Berkeley in the South End. And it was a haven, I found, for a number of interracial couples, because we were in Boston at the time in a period where, frankly, there was a lot of racial tension. And interracial couples, to be honest, could face problems if they lived in certain neighborhoods. One or the other partner could have encountered some hostility. Now, if you were rich enough and you were interracial, you could move to a suburb where that was less likely to be a problem. But I was struck that this publicly aided resource became a place where people of limited income and interracial couples could live in a kind of social peace. It was an example of how the public sector can behave appropriately. We've moved well beyond that, but it was important at the time. But I learned at the time, too, that these were projects which were affordable temporarily, but because of decisions made years ago, none of us here made them, they could expire. Now, here's the problem, and it's an interesting one. We now face a serious problem in trying to get affordable housing built, in addition to the problem of resources, and it is what, in my judgment, is an excessively negative view towards people in neighborhoods. There is an unduly critical approach. Whenever you talk about building any kind of affordable housing, you run into, oh, not near me, and it's going to ruin my neighborhood. The fact that we have this problem with preservation is one example of how inaccurate that perception is, because what we're now facing is this. We are talking about preserving in an affordable way housing that was built 30, 40 years ago. I know at the time it was built, not today's neighbors, they probably weren't around, but people very much like the people who today object to the erection of subsidized housing were complaining about this housing, saying, don't build this in my neighborhood. You're going to deteriorate my neighborhood. I don't want those projects in my neighborhood. And what do we have today? The contemporary equivalents of the people who objected to the housing in the first place now want to buy up the housing and move the poor people out. In other words, contrary to this objection that was going to ruin the neighborhood, it's now deemed to be so attractive that we have to protect the poor people economically from being priced out of this housing by people who objected to its construction in the first place on the argument that it was going to be blight. And I hope people will understand this. I was particularly struck by that, and so obviously there was an overwhelming logic to this. Indeed, the fact that we still do have this problem about where you locate housing is an overwhelming argument for preserving this housing, because it averts the debate about where to put it. Preserving existing affordable housing greatly improves our ability to get the housing done. It is also almost certainly going to be more economical. Now, there's been some difference here. In the late 80s, my colleague Joe Kennedy and I, under the leadership of one of the great housing advocates in our country's history, Henry B. Gonzalez, adopted some legislation to try to preserve the affordable housing. Let me be clear. I wish they hadn't passed a law that gave the owners the right to opt out. But I wish I could eat more and not gain weight. My wishes are often not binding. And so we have to accommodate ourselves to reality. We cannot abrogate people's constitutional rights. We can give people inducements to keep this housing, and fortunately, in many cases, the people who did this are people who want to do this or who have continued it. So what we did was to provide the best inducements we could to stay in. Now, when party control changed, there was a difference in philosophy. And beginning in 1995, the legislation we had in place to preserve the tenancies was replaced by legislation to protect the tenants. But as those tenants die or move out, the unit is lost. It's also kind of expensive, and here's my problem. It was part of this voucher thing, and I think the voucher program is a good one. Enhanced vouchers, of course, are costly, but the basic problem is if you have a voucher-only program, and it's a program where you only have annual vouchers, you are adding to the demand for housing in a way that does not help the supply. And while that provides some equity, it generates upward price pressure. I'm for the voucher program, but it should be accompanied by efforts to deal with the supply as well. We are now going back to that, and I hope that we will be able to come up, and I know various groups are working, and I appreciate it, both from HUD to the tenant groups to others. We want to preserve the housing. We've seen, people may not understand that until it happens, but we saw in New York State, New York City, the outcry when it looked like Starrett City might go out of the inventory, and we worked together, House and Senate. We've got language in the bill that I hope is going to pass that will preserve Starrett City. We've had others come to us. Our colleague here on this committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Ms. Price, has sponsored a bill that would protect some housing from going out of the inventory in Columbus, worked on with Ohio State. Mr. Dingle from Michigan, Mr. Markey. We've been doing it ad hoc. The time has come to do the best we can overall. And now let me just say, and I appreciate the indulgence, I had invited a witness who, because of health, couldn't come. But let me read an excerpt of the statement I can. I would ask you to have the whole statement come in. Preservation of affordable housing is an issue we have been grappling with for many years. I've been strongly committed to the idea since 1967. In 1977, I was approached by a group of tenants from Meth Union Manor, a HUD-assisted church-sponsored nonprofit property located in Boston's South End, not the one I talked about, but one I visited last Monday. Meth Union Manor and the church that's its mainstay. Meth Union Manor was built in 1970 when the South End was a low-income neighborhood undergoing urban renewal. 7 years later, in part because of the lack of adequate HUD asset management tools, the property had fallen into financial default and physical distress. At the time, like many urban communities in America today, the South End had begun to gentrify. The Department of HUD, which insured the mortgage, was about to foreclose on the property. By the way, this is in the Democratic administration. This is a nonpartisan issue. He's talking 1977, the Carter administration. The tenants believed, and rightly so, that their buildings would be sold to the highest bidder without the existing long-term affordability requirements, and they would all be priced out of their homes. I worked with members of this committee to enact a provision, Housing and Community Development Amendments of 1978, that for the first time required HUD to sell properties facing foreclosure to groups that would preserve affordable housing, including local governments and non-tenant profit organizations, tenant non-profit organizations or non-profits, and provided adequate resources to ensure affordability and decent quality. As a result of that legislation and with HUD's subsequent cooperation, Meth Union Manor is today a thriving, affordable, limited equity cooperative that is owned and controlled by its residents and which continues to contribute to the South End's historic diversity. And it closes with a plea, the time is act to now. I commend the committee for examining ways to maintain the existing supply of affordable rental housing and allow us to focus our efforts on preserving units and protecting the tenants. And it is a statement submitted by former Senator Edward Brooke, who served in the United States Senate for 12 years and was, as he indicates here, in 1977 and 78, one of the first to get legislation enacted to preserve affordable housing. So I want to stress again, this is a bipartisan issue. This began with a Republican senator preserving affordable housing from an effort that was going to be undertaken by a Democratic administration. And what Senator Brooke acted on and what he urged us to do, he was, of course, also the author of the Brooke Amendment, which is the basis for limiting the rents that are charged in public housing and in subsidized housing. So I am very much moved. Senator Brooke called when he heard about what we were doing and volunteered that he would like to be helpful in the effort. He'd hoped to be able to come health reasons, he wasn't able to come, but he did submit this statement because, as I said, he's really the pioneer in what we're trying to do. He was a Republican senator very concerned about housing, and I hope we can continue these efforts. And I appreciate the indulgence of my colleagues, and I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from West Virginia.